Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Yesterday we were discussing political socialization, and we left off talking about some of the agents of political socialization. We all experience these agents as we grow up, and as adults as well, but they don't always affect everybody in the same way, and for some, family may be more important, for others the media, it just depends. But they can all be important. So this was the slide we left off with, and so what I want to talk about today is to continue our discussion of public opinion and political socialization, and to suggest to you, first of all, that our political views and our party identification are often shaped by our membership in, or affiliation with, or identification with one or another social or demographic group. So we'll talk about some of those demographic factors. And here are some. There are many. By no means did I list all of them. If you want to look at all of the demographic factors, go to a website that talks about demography, and it'll give you all kinds of demographic variables. But political socialization and our political attitudes and opinions and our party ID and the way we vote and our levels of political participation, high or low, and many other political factors can be associated with various demographic variables. And when I use the term, the words can be, because they may or may not be for any individual person, but for groups of people, some will be more important than others. So income is one important demographic variable. All other things equal, people with high income are more likely to vote than people with low. People with high income are more likely to make contributions to political campaigns or to political parties than lower income people. They're more likely to, all other things equal, to participate in political campaigns. Level of education shapes the way people vote, perhaps in unexpected ways. One of the, and so does income. I might note, for example, that if you, and by the way, you can see data on this. You can see data on these issues a lot of different ways. One of the easiest places to find it is at CNN Election Central, which breaks down national and state data in presidential election years. And you can look at and see what types of groups, how they voted in one state or even one county. So education, level of education is important, and income is important. I wanted to mention one thing about the 2008 election, for example, when Barack Obama was elected. If you look at the distribution of the vote by income, what you'll find is the lowest, people with the lowest income tended to vote for Barack Obama, and as the income started to rise, they were more likely to vote for John McCain. Except when you got to the highest income level, they tended, by a slight margin, to vote more for Barack Obama. Often these demographic variables, not always, but income would be one, they're looked at in terms of quintiles. And a quintile is basically a fifth of the population. So you get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 with, in terms of income, with the highest quintile being those with the highest income, the lowest 20% with the lowest income, and so forth. Education also has some impact on political attitudes, political participation, and voting behavior. Economic status. We already talked about income. Economic status is obviously closely related. But it's not just income. For example, economic status might be whether you're employed or not, whether you're employed part-time or full-time. So there are a number of factors there. Religious variables are important. There's data that consistently show that people in some religious denominations are more likely to vote either for Democrats or Republicans. For example, Protestants, all other things equal, tend to vote more often for Republicans. Catholics historically used to vote more Democratic, but now are split close to 50-50. Jews used to vote maybe 80% for Democrats. Now it's probably closer to 70%. Even more important and compelling can be the level of religious commitment. And what I mean by that is how often someone attends church or synagogue or religious services. And the more frequently one attends religious services, compared to those who rarely attend or never attend religious services, those data tend to correlate with certain ways of voting. Race and ethnicity is a factor. African Americans tend to vote overwhelmingly, maybe 90 to 95%, for Democratic candidates. Hispanics are also maybe 2/3 voting Democratic. Keep in mind, though, that all Hispanics are not alike. They have different national origins. Though Cuban Americans, for example, are probably much more evenly divided between the parties and in terms of their party ID and their voting behavior. Latinos are more likely to vote Democratic. Age can be an important factor in I might add that Asians tend to vote a bit more Democratic than Republican as well. Age can be a factor. One of the telling pieces of data regarding electoral behavior deals with voters under 30 in the last couple of elections. And the older one there's a difference between older and younger voters. There's several differences. One difference between older and younger voters is that older voters have voted more often than younger voters simply because they were legally able to vote, and more often than younger voters. But they also have different, and we'll talk about this in a minute, they also have different levels of political knowledge and different kinds of political experience and different kinds of historical events in our society that affect their behavior. Gender and marital status correlates with how people vote. Women tend to vote more Democratic than Republican. Single women are even more likely to vote Democratic than Republican. Married women are, I don't know exactly, but are probably close to 50-50, but it breaks down by, if you look at it by religious and ethnic and age differences, then married women and race and ethnicity, you get different kinds of voting behavior based on those other demographic variables. Your state, your geographic region can be important in voter behavior. I mean, if you go to Utah and you are not in Salt Lake City, you're going to find you've got mostly Republicans there. If you go to Minnesota or Vermont or state of California or Maryland, you're going to find that the majority of voters are Democratic, overwhelmingly Democratic. If you go to Mississippi, you go to Alabama, you go to Texas, there are going to be more Republican voters there. So there are state differences. There are other states that are historically very close in their partisan divide, and they have been for a long time. The state of Ohio is a very good example. The state of Ohio breaks down very, very close to 50-50 between the parties, and in fact, the state of Ohio is always viewed in presidential elections as absolutely essential to determine who's going to win the election. Urban voters tend to vote Democratic. Rural voters tend to vote Republican. Suburban voters tend to be split fairly evenly between the two, depending on the nature of the suburb. All suburbs are not the same. So in Cincinnati, for example, one suburb is Lincoln Heights. Lincoln Heights is one of the first, pretty much all majority African-American suburbs in the country. Tends to vote Democratic. You go to just east on the other side of I-75 in Evendale, another suburb which is white and affluent, they're more likely to vote Republican. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is that this is really not so simple. And one reason for individuals it's not so simple. And the reason is that many people have, for lack of a better term, conflicting tendencies in their demographic characteristics. So that makes it harder to know, it makes it harder for that person because that person is faced with conflicting tendencies. So, for example, if one takes a unmarried, younger woman voter, say 25, in Alabama is overwhelmingly Republican, but single women tend to be overwhelmingly Democratic. And then there are other issues that would bring into play. Well, what about religious commitment? What about race and ethnicity? What about income and education? And so it's for any single person, it's hard. Any individual person, it's hard to predict exactly what their behavior will be, and of course, unless you talk to them. But there are a number of demographic factors at work. Any comments or questions? Okay. Well, political events also socialize us and help form the way we think about politics. Sometimes there are generational effects. And those generational effects are, I mean, for example, how many of you remember the Cuban Missile Crisis? None of you. You weren't alive. But for those who were young adults and adults during the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was a huge event, national event, global event. And it scared a lot of people. So there are a number of these, and I've listed some of them. The Great Depression. You know, during the 1930s, levels of unemployment reached in excess of 25% nationally. In some parts of the country, they were more. People were jumping out of skyscrapers to their deaths. Okay, obviously, this wasn't on TV because there was no TV then. But the Great Depression was not just was a global event, but obviously it was an important event in American culture and the American economy, because so many people had so little. The election of President Kennedy, the Kennedy administration, the Kennedy quote-unquote mystique was sometimes referred to as Camelot. You had a very handsome president, you had a very beautiful first lady, two little gorgeous children, a very articulate president, upper class, both of them, and it was a major cultural, not just a political event, but a cultural event. That era in which Kennedy was president. And so there was a lot of, romance. I don't mean that in the sense one normally uses the term romance, but there was a good feeling about that administration, and part of it had to do with the style and grace, perhaps, of the president and first lady. Then there's Watergate. Again, this was over 40 years ago. This was 40 years ago when President Nixon resigned. None of you, that you may have read about it, but you didn't experience it at the time. One of the reasons scandals, or so-called scandals, sometimes end with the term gate is because of Watergate. Watergate was a hotel and residential complex in Washington, D.C., where the Democratic National Committee's offices were burglarized by people who were hired by the president and the president's campaign, and ultimately he resigned. So that was a low point for the presidency. And my wife and I were sitting with my grandmother watching Nixon's resignation speech 40 years ago. And we still talk about that. The Civil Rights Movement and the Vietnam War. The 60s were a very exciting time. And the Civil Rights Movement was flourishing. The Vietnam War was gearing up. People were being drafted, over 500,000 American troops in Vietnam. And it was the first television war. And so my generation was very much affected by both the Civil Rights Movement and the Vietnam War and the anti-war movement. The September 11 attacks 13 years ago probably are those attacks September 11 is probably one of the more formative political events for your generation. I'm not saying that there aren't others, but I would think certainly that's 14 years ago. So maybe it's even too far back for it to be formative, since you're only about 3 or 4. Do you remember that day? Do you remember September 11 or not? Do you have a memory of that?
Yes.
Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay, but you were very little at the time, certainly, and you may or may not have been old enough to. It may be that subsequent events following from the terrorist attacks of September 11 may have had more impact on you than the day of the attack itself. Sometimes the country's political mood seems to shift. And I would suggest a couple factors that can be important here. One is the state of the economy. And one quick and dirty measure of the state of the economy is what are unemployment rates like. Generally speaking, the higher the unemployment rate, the more difficult it is for political incumbents, that is, those who currently hold office, who are running for re-election, the more difficult they find re-election to be. The lower the unemployment rate, all other things equal, probably the easier it is. If the unemployment rate is low, people's incomes are rising as a consequence, that tends to, that people aren't as upset, people aren't as worried or concerned about either themselves or the country if the economy is going well and their own personal economic situation seems to be improving. Sometimes people engage in retrospective voting. And I'll talk about some other things related to this in a little bit. Retrospective voting is when you come up to an election and you go back and you've got to vote and you look at it. Often this is discussed with respect to voting for president. So how were the last 4 years? Were they good? Were they bad? Were they in between? How did the country do? How did this particular president or office holder do to the degree that people have some level of satisfaction? That tends to redound to the benefit of those currently in office and running for re-election. The higher the dissatisfaction, the greater the tendency for incumbents to be voted out of office. But as we will see later in the course, in fact, it's very difficult to vote incumbents out of office, and we'll talk about that more later. Comments? Well, this is an example of data on, in general, are you satisfied or dissatisfied with the way things are going in the United States at this time? And this covers from just before 1980 to 2013, and you can see there's some significant variation. The high levels seem to be pretty clear, around 70%. During the last year or so of the Clinton administration, very high. Just before President Clinton was reelected, when Reagan was, 1986 is the midpoint of Reagan's second year. Another high point, the low point is clearly when the economy imploded and in 2008, 2009, unemployment was very high nationally in double digits, and you can see the high level of dissatisfaction. And it is not uncommon. We'll talk about this more when we talk about the presidency, but it's not uncommon that the popularity of presidents, if they get into their second term, tends to decline. But this is this is a very commonly asked question. A similar question that's often asked of the American people in polls is, do you think the country's on the right track or the wrong track? And literally, that's the question. Again, it's very open, very general. Are you satisfied or dissatisfied with the way things are going? Very similar question. A common poll question, and it gives people in the country a sense of political mood. So, any comments? Okay, so voters, first of all, a lot of people don't vote. In fact, most Americans don't vote in most elections. Voting participation in the United States is lower than for many, many countries in the world. Not just 2 or 3, more like 20 or 30, maybe more. So Americans aren't in love with voting. And each election type is different. The election where voter turnout is the highest is a presidential election year, the November general election in 2008, 2012, 2016, and turnout there might be 60%. That would be slightly on the high side. Local elections can be very different. Just as an example, Cincinnati not long ago had a primary election, excuse me. Primary election determines which party's candidates are going to be running for mayor, in this case, in the general election. You know what the turnout was? 8%. 8%. And that's pretty low. That's very low. Normally, in off-year elections or in gubernatorial election years, it might be 35 or 40%, sometimes a little bit higher. But in fact, it's interesting. Americans tend to think that state and local government is closer to the people, and yet their voting behavior is much lower with regard to state and local elections if there's no national election on the ballot. So voters have to try to make sense of political campaigns, political candidates, political parties, and elections. And there are a number of election-specific factors that determine how people might vote or what kinds of things they're looking at. First of all, we've already suggested that a lot of people aren't too interested in politics, and a lot of people aren't too interested in elections. So the lower the interest level, the lower of information, attentiveness toward politics and elections, probably the less likely people are going to vote. The political scientists also talk about the quality of political efficacy, the belief that an individual might have that he or she can make a difference. And to the degree that one's political efficacy is low, that might be correlated with a tendency not to vote as often. Sometimes though, one really can make a difference. In a recent election for school funding in the town my daughter lives in, the funding measure for the public schools passed by one vote. One. So another factor, besides attentiveness toward politics, state primary and general election laws shape how often people vote. What am I talking about here? Well, I'm talking about things like when you can register to vote, how you can register to vote, how long you have to be a resident of the state, what the laws are governing primary elections, the length of time polls are open. There are all kinds of election laws and regulations that shape how often people vote and whether they vote. If I told you that election day is coming up and the closest polling place to your home was 30 miles away, how likely would you be to vote? Probably less likely than if it were 30 blocks away. So even the location of voting places can be very important. Okay, normally though, political scientists talk about 3 factors that shape voting behavior. The first is perception of a candidate or candidates. And this is often based on emotions rather than experience or policy. That is to say, you know, you look at somebody on TV or see an ad or what have you, and how does this person appear? Does this person seem genuine? Does this person seem like you can trust them, and so on? I personally find this to be a not very good way of evaluating candidates for office, simply because they're on TV. They've got people who are coaching them about how to be good TV actors. You can't know. I don't see how you can look at somebody on TV and say, yes, this person is trustworthy, or this person has great integrity. You don't even know this person. So, but nonetheless, and I would even argue that this is a pretty powerful way people determine how they're going to vote, and often it's about perceptions of strength and weakness. Does this person seem strong? Does this person seem weak? Well, if they're weak, they're no good. If they're strong, they're good. Obviously, not everybody votes on the basis of their perception of the candidates, but in fact, it is not insignificant. Secondly, another basis for the way people vote is issue priorities, preferences, and intensity. So there's a long laundry list of issues in electoral politics and in American government. Probably some of them are not of great interest for many people. So priorities matter. And in other words, if you have no issue priorities, then obviously issue is not going to be a basis for your vote. But some people have very intense beliefs or feelings about certain issues rather than others. I'll give you, single issue voters would be voters who A, have a few policy priorities, B, have strong preferences, and in fact, those preferences are very strong, so strong that they're inclined to vote for one or another candidate or party because of that issue alone. Then there's party identification, and party ID is generally more stable than either the perception of candidates or one's view of issues for most voters. Party ID is simply, do you consider yourself a Democrat or a Republican or something else? And often the questions that are asked by pollsters are, do you consider yourself a strong Democrat, or a strong Republican, or maybe a leaning Republican, or a leaning Democrat, or neutral? Those are the kinds of questions or options that are often given to voters in polling situations. Party ID tends to be, it is not always, but it tends to be more stable, meaning that if your parents are both of one political party, chances are that you are more likely to have that same party identification. If your entire family tends to be, an extended family tends to have one or another party affiliation or identification, you're also more likely to follow in that vein. Nonetheless, opinion is often contradictory. Probably the safest thing to say about American public opinion that it is complicated and contradictory. Many surveys, I think we talked about this briefly earlier, indicate that Americans want more and better services from government, but they also prefer lower and higher taxes. There's a problem there. Our values, or if you prefer, our preferences, are in contradiction, and somehow we must negotiate and choose among them in order to make political choices. And the same is true for many people with respect to the process of political socialization. It's not particularly common for individual. It may be more common than it used to be, but with the internet. But generally speaking, there are contradictory forces that make us have to think about how it is we're going to affiliate politically or vote. One of the things candidates and parties do, and the media do as well, is to try to measure public opinion, especially when it comes to elections. And so this chart taken from the text is an example of the various poll results for the 2012 Ohio Republican primary. You can see that the Merriman poll projected a Romney margin of victory by 5%. The Suffolk poll, Romney lost by 4%. That's a 9% difference, which means somebody's not doing a good job in doing their polling. It's important. There are a number of. We're going to talk about polling for the rest of the morning. First of all, there are issues with polls, things that you need to consider. First, a poll is a snapshot. A poll is an electoral selfie. Okay? You take a selfie, and that's how you were for that instant. That's how you looked, and 1 second later, you're doing something else, and you look different. Now, people may not change their political opinions quite so rapidly, but a poll is a snapshot. And so events happen, things change, people get new information. A poll is simply a snapshot in time. Poll questions can bias the outcomes or the findings of polls. If a question is not formulated and asked in the correct manner, it can produce results that have very little relationship to the actual structure and distribution of opinion. This is not only true with respect to elections, but to anything else as well. There are unscientific and fraudulent polls. One of the political features of the internet age is that it's now a lot easier to ask people things, to create a poll and have them respond. And then there are push polls. Push polls are, in my judgment, a particularly pernicious entrant to the electoral process, and I'm going to give you what I think is the worst example of a push poll. It's really not a poll at all. It's a wolf in sheep's clothing kind of poll. In 2000, George W. Bush was running for the Republican nomination against John McCain, and one of the early primary states and very critical primary states was South Carolina. And those who were supporting President Bush, most specifically, what is his name? I'll think of it in a minute. Some supporting President Bush designed a push poll. The push poll was a telephone poll that supporters of George Bush and his candidacy called likely Republican primary voters, and they asked the following question. First, are you going to vote in the Republican primary? And if they said yes, they said, okay, well, are you going to vote for George W. Bush, or are you going to vote for John McCain? And they get an answer, and then the pollster, quote unquote, would ask the question, if you knew that John McCain was the father of an African American child, would you be more or less likely to vote for him? Well, in South Carolina, people said, well, we're going to be less likely to vote for John McCain. Well, the fact of the matter is John McCain never had an African American child. He never adopted an African American child. He and his wife adopted a Bangladeshi child. But the point of the push poll was to put into voters' consciousness that one particular candidate was the father of a black child in a state that has a long history of racial politics. George W. Bush won that primary election. And I can't believe I can't remember the name of the guy who did it. It was Bush's main advisor. And I know perfectly well what he looks like, and I'm right now blanking on his name, but you see him on Fox News all the time. Okay. Maybe one more slide here, and then we'll deal with another matter. Opinion polls have been around for maybe 80 years, and the earlier organizations were Gallup, Roper, and Harris. Now many of the media organizations collaborate to create, organizations like CNN, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post are some of the common media outlets that do polling. Nate Silver, who created 538.com. 538, of course, is the number of electoral college votes in presidential elections. Nate Silver is, I think, hands down, the most accurate pollster out there. And when I wanted to look at how campaigns and elections were shaping up, I would look at Nate Silver's work, and he does non-political stuff as well. His work is just first rate. There are different kinds of polls, or different origins of polls. Some are professional and media polls, like we just mentioned. Some are, and some professional pollsters are routinely employed by one or another political party. PPP is one of the polling organizations. They tend to be associated with the Democratic Party. There are others. Rasmussen tends to have a more Republican Party bias, and then others have reputations of being more neutral. But parties and candidates both employ polls, and yet it remains an inexact art or science. One of the polling that Fox News was using in the last presidential election was abysmally inaccurate, and it was kind of at the time kind of a quote unquote media scandal that they were so far off. I don't think we can get into this next issue, so we're going to pick up on this next time right here at this slide. But I want to ask a question before you leave. We have 1 minute left. I want to show you a video, about a 9-minute video, next class. Lacey, Ms. Cousin informs me that I can't really show the video from my end, and I'm wondering whether you're able to show a 9-minute video that's on YouTube so that you can hear and see it. Is that something that you guys can do?
Yes.
Okay. Well, whoever knows how to do this, what I would like you to do is to have ready with your technology, with your computer, if you would go to, hello, where did it go? Okay, if you would go to this slide, which is on Blackboard, and copy it and have this ready to go. Maybe we'll end the class next time with this. Has anybody heard of the comedian George Carlin? Yes or no?
Yeah.
How many students raise their hands so I can so you can tell me how many hands are in the air you've heard of him?
Only one.
Only one, okay. Well, I'm going to do you a favor. I'm going to introduce you to George Carlin, and he is a very, very, very funny guy. I am going to do so, believe it or not, with a video that has only one swear word, and that is hell, which is quite unusual for George Carlin. But I was able to find one that was relevant to the course and to the topic that we're dealing with. And I think probably your school won't be too upset with that word. But you will not only learn something about politics and political socialization from that video, but hopefully you will find this guy. He's no longer alive, unfortunately. You will find that he is one of the most compelling comedians and philosophers of our time. See you next time tomorrow morning. Have a nice day.